Best investment of 2022. And I'm going to say holding cash and Mexican government bonds, which might come as a surprise. But I feel like
very smart, George.
if you just didn't want to have to worry about anything this year, the best thing for you to do would have been buying bonds. And one really interesting thing are Mexican government bonds, right, which are called CETES. Surprisingly, the Mexican peso has been very, very resilient and has actually gained a little bit of value compared to the US dollar. It used to be maybe $1 used to be 21 pesos, 22 pesos, and now it's down to 19 pesos, and it's stayed there. So the Mexican peso is strong compared to the dollar. And the interest rates that government bonds are paying out at the moment is just insane. We're talking about like 10 to 11% annually. So that would have probably been the best investment. I invested a little bit throughout this year, but into Mexican government bonds. Probably the best move would have been just selling it all and just putting it into those bonds at the beginning of this year. So that's my best investment. That's my winner. Bonds, government bonds. What about you?
I agree with you, cash and Mexican government bonds, because this is not the same for other countries. I mean, the US treasuries have been wildly affected by the hike in interest rates, but Mexican government bonds, maybe Brazilian government bonds are like some of the best performing, because those two currencies have not lose ground against the US dollar. You know, there was like this super US dollar phenomenon. Like we saw the euro getting to parity with the USD and even losing ground to the US dollar. So both the Mexican peso and the Brazilian real have been quite strong. So that has made their government bonds really, really a good investment. Considering more risk, by far the best performing, well, I think the best performing category or investment that you could find with reason, like not being speculating too much, considering large companies, was oil companies, the energy sector, right? I think that we know that in inflation times, when there is high inflation, commodities tend to perform really well. And for sure, like the energy sector was tremendously successful in 2022. So I'll go with that, with oil companies. Not only oil. I do not recommend, like, for medium or long-term investors to just buy and hold commodities, but rather investing in companies that in some way or another add value with those commodities. Right, I totally agree with you, especially for thinking in terms of having less risk exposure. But for those open for more risk, best performing investment, I think, was oil in general, right? Like energy stocks or the energy sector.
Okay. How do you feel about government interference in terms of like pricing? Because I don't know if you know, in Germany, just today, I believe they released a law basically putting a cap on the price of gas. Do you think that's a trend that's going to continue and is going to affect other commodities as well?
I don't know. I think it's more difficult to see that happen in the US. I think it's easier to expect more of that in Europe, especially because I think Europe has much more pressure because of how dependent they were to Russia in terms of energy. But I think that there is a high risk with that. That's why I was mentioning that this is the sort of investment that has much more volatility, and it's such an important part of our economy and making things work. Starting for, like, you know, having heat in the European winter, right? So yeah, I think that the risk of having like government interference is pretty high right now. But still, in terms of valuations, a lot of these international oil companies, I think they still have a lot of room to grow in terms of their stock price. And something really interesting, you know, like a lot of investors dumped these energy stocks, especially for companies that were focused on oil extraction or production, or, you know, anything related to oil. But lots of these large companies are starting to invest heavily in renewables, in new sources of energy. So potentially, I think that what could happen is that in the next decades, some of these hated oil companies transform into some of the most important renewable energy companies, right? So I think there are really interesting opportunities there.